So Apple has updated its lineup of iPads in what they call the biggest update since its launch. In this video, I want to give my initial thoughts on that, some reactions to what was launched yesterday. I want to talk about some of the good things and also the things that Apple maybe glossed over and didn't tell us about. I just want to apologize for my slightly croaky voice today. I've had this sore throat thing for a couple of weeks, but I can't delay making videos any longer, so you'll have to put up with it. Sorry about that. So let's start with the good stuff, and that is the iPad 10 is now available for $349 or £349 here in the UK. That for me is a bit of a bargain. There is no other tablet you can buy at that price point that is as capable as iPad 10. And for the vast majority of users who are getting an iPad for all the usual stuff, content consumption, bit of email, bit of light gaming, all of that kind of stuff, the iPad 10 is going to be more than enough iPad for you. Another piece of good news is the updates to the Apple Pencil, which they're now calling Pencil Pro. And I think the best piece of news is that Apple resisted the temptation to whack up the price of that new pencil. So it's still at $129, but now you're getting a bit more for your money because there are new ways to interact with the pencil. You can now squeeze it, and also there's a gyro, so you can do something called barrel roll. Now, if you're an artist, I think that might make a big difference. If you're a general iPad user, it probably won't make any difference to you, but it's a nice thing to have. Another thing that's really nice to see on the pencil is haptic feedback. And again, for artists, I imagine that's going to make a bit of a difference when you kind of snap into grid and you get that positive feedback from the pencil itself. So that's really nice to see. More good news came with the iPad Air. Now we have a bigger size available, so you don't have to go all the way to the iPad Pro to get that larger 13-inch screen. So if you prefer the larger format, then iPad Air 13-inch gives you a more affordable entry into a large tablet. Sticking with the iPad Air, great news in that the base level storage has doubled in size from 64 gigabytes to 128 gigabytes. Of course, in computing terms, 128 gigs is still pretty miserly, but I've always found with iPad, I don't use all of the storage. I went out and bought a 1 terabyte iPad Pro and I found I never actually use more than 128 gigs on it. So your mileage may vary, of course, but it's nice to see that base storage being doubled, and the price point of the 11-inch stays exactly the same at $599 or £599 here in the UK. I think some of the best news is that the camera has finally been moved to the landscape edge of the tablet where it always should have been. This is on both the iPad Air and the iPad Pro. So it means when you use the iPad for video calls in landscape mode, which is typically what you're going to do, then it means that you're looking directly at the person you're talking to rather than having this weird effect of looking off to the side. That was something that really bugged me on my M1 iPad Pro, which I've since sold. So I'm very happy to see that Apple has changed this. Now, when I was originally griping about the position of that camera, I had a few people comment on the channel saying that Apple wouldn't have been able to move the camera to the landscape edge because that's where the pencil attaches. But they have been able to do that, although there is a caveat to that I'll come back to later. But the new pencil still attaches to the same location on the iPad. When it comes to the iPad Pro, of course, it gets that new OLED display, or what we should say, a Tandem OLED display that goes super bright. We'll talk about that in a moment. But I think the best news is that the 11-inch, so the smaller iPad Pro, gets the same display as the 13-inch. On previous models, if you bought the 13-inch or the larger one, then you got the mini LED display. But if you bought the smaller iPad Pro, you got a standard display. Again, we get the front-facing camera on the landscape edge, where it should have always been. And we get that base storage being doubled again, in this case to 256 gigs. And this new display technology means that the iPad can be much thinner. So the 11-inch model is 5.3 millimeters and the 13-inch model is 5.1 millimeters. And that is very thin indeed. Of course, the most major announcement was the release of the M4 chip. And I have to say, I saw all of the rumors saying that this was going to happen, but it still took me a little bit by surprise because it doesn't make sense to me for Apple to release the M4 chip at this point in time and to release it in an iPad. So let's just talk about this, and starting with the reason why Apple has done this, because they did hint at it during the event. And it is all to do with the need for a new display engine for that Tandem OLED display. So I would guess that the display engine that's in the previous M chips isn't up to the job, so they needed to have that. And this is one of the problems, I guess, with having a system on chip where everything is on one chip. You can't just change out one part of it. You need to tape out a new chip, and that's what Apple has done. But to do that 7 months after the launch of M3 does feel like a bit of a kick in the teeth for anyone like me who's been out and spent their money on an M3 MacBook Air. Now, it's probably the case that the M4 isn't major leaps and bounds ahead of M3. It'll probably just be a small iteration, so it's not something that we need to worry about. The M3 is a really capable chip. It's not like our M3 MacBook Airs have suddenly got slower. It's just that notion or that feeling when you've spent that much money on something to then feel like it's outdated within 7 months. I mean, the gap between the previous chips, I think M1 to M2 was about 19 months, something like that, and M2 to M3 was about 16 months. So to do this in 7 months is very fast. I mean, we haven't even seen the M3 Ultra yet. We haven't seen the M3 go into the Mac Studio or the Mac Mini. And here comes the other problem. They're pressing on at a pace with the hardware and they're releasing this chip in an iPad, which doesn't have the software that is able to take advantage of that hardware. That's what I'm finding a bit confusing. So we've got this M4 chip, and iPadOS is still iPadOS. It doesn't allow you to tap into the full performance of an M chip. In fact, iPadOS can't even use all of the features of the M chip. The reason why Apple are putting M chips into iPads is because it's convenient. It's cheaper than designing an iPad-specific chip. They just have this one SKU and they just use it everywhere because iPadOS can use the same chip. But Apple is kind of glossing over the fact that this incredible performance, this amazing device they've created with this phenomenal hardware, I mean, it's inconceivable how much power is in this super thin tablet compared to just a few years ago, what we were used to with our computers. But you really can't tap into that unless you're using some very specific software. And my guess is that you're probably all pretty fed up of hearing about video editing because I get those comments quite a lot on the channel when we test something, because Apple designed these chips for ultimate performance in things like video editing. So typically that's where YouTubers will test it out. And of course, we're doing video work, so it's relevant to us. But to a huge part of our audience, it's not relevant. How many people are actually going to be using an iPad to edit video on, either with DaVinci Resolve or with the new version of Final Cut? Although I have to say the new live multicam thing looks amazing, and that could be a real game changer for people who are starting out with YouTubing or podcasting or vlogging, and you want to have a multicam setup or do live streaming, and you want to just use your iPhone that you've already got as a camera, link it to Final Cut. Brilliant. But how many of you out there who are interested in buying an iPad are actually going to be doing that? It's probably quite few. And even then, if you were doing that, could you not do that on one of the less powerful iPads? Well, the answer is yes, you could. And unless you're really pushing the boundaries, you're not going to be able to use the full performance of that chip. Here's the other thing that Apple didn't tell you. They talked about the makeup of the chip. So it's now got 4 performance cores and 6 efficiency cores. Now, previously with M1 through M3, it's been 4 of each. So now we've got 2 additional efficiency cores. And it is quite clear that Apple has prioritized power efficiency with the M4 chip because they're talking about offering the same CPU performance as M2, but with half of the power consumption. And presumably that means longer battery life on the iPad, although Apple didn't talk about that. So that remains to be seen. But here's the thing, if you buy the iPad Pro, you don't get 4 performance cores unless you're buying the model with at least 1 terabyte storage. So if you buy the 1 terabyte or 2 terabyte model, you get the full M4 chip. If you buy a model with 256 or 512 storage, then you're getting 3 performance cores. Now in an iPad, again, we've just been talking about how iPadOS can't make full use of the performance of the M chips. And let's be honest here, there's very little that the M4 iPad can do that the M1 iPad can't do. I think it's probably limited to graphics things like hardware ray tracing, which the M1 doesn't have. Do you need that on your iPad? I don't know. So losing a performance core on an iPad isn't the end of the world, but it does paint a dark picture for the future of MacBooks. Now previously, when you have a binned chip, so for instance, if you buy a 13-inch MacBook Air and you get the base level model, what you're getting is a binned chip. And historically, those have had fewer graphics cores. I think 1 fewer on M1 and M2 and possibly 2 fewer on M3. Correct me if I'm wrong there in the comments. But losing graphics cores on a MacBook Air, I don't think is a big deal. Losing a performance core on your CPU, that is a big deal. I don't like the way that's going. So I'm hoping the binned chips, when these things come out to the MacBooks, probably next year, I'm hoping they won't be like that. There's another thing that happens when you go up to 1 TB or above of storage, and that is that you get double the RAM. So you go from 8 GB to 16 GB. And you might be thinking, well, that's a fantastic upgrade. But yet again, there are very few apps that will actually be able to tap into that. And it's not like the iPad is doing multitasking in the same way that macOS is. Now, true, if you've got the 16 GB iPad and you like to have lots and lots of apps open, then the time it takes to switch from one active app to another is a bit less. But in real world use, most people aren't going to notice the difference. But the thing is, you're paying for that difference. You've got to pay for that extra 8 GB of RAM. So it makes that step up from the 512 model to the 1 TB model quite a bit to swallow. So I'm just going to spec up an 11-inch model here. If you go for 512, then it is $1,199 or pounds. And if you go up to 1 TB, well, that's an extra $400. So yes, you are getting double the storage and you're getting double the RAM and you're getting that extra performance core. So you might say that's worth $400. But let's not forget, you can buy an entire iPad 10 for less than that. There's another little gotcha that Apple didn't mention. They talk about the nano glass option. So this helps to reduce reflection. So if you want to use your iPad outside, which you might do if you're using it, say, for monitoring a film production or something like that, and it's got that beautiful bright display, well, you can reduce reflections with the nano glass option. But it is only available as a $100 option once you're at 1 TB or above. It's not available on the 256 or 512 model. And maybe that's not even a problem, because do you even want nano texture glass? I would say it's a fairly niche use case and a very small group of users that would actually want it. And bear in mind that when we've seen nano texture glass before, it tends to reduce the contrast of the display, reduce the sharpness, and can be a little bit fragile as well. You've got to be very specific about how you clean it. Not sure that's the right thing for an iPad. Now, I guess another good thing is the fact that they've standardized the sizes of the iPad Air and the iPad Pro. So now you've got a more affordable iPad that's available in little and large, and you've got the more expensive iPad also available in little and large. And that means that their accessories will work with both. So you can use the new Pencil Pro with either, and you can use the new Magic Keyboard with either. And the new Magic Keyboard does look very nice indeed, and a decent step up over the previous design, which had that kind of soft touch finish, which always ended up with tide marks where your wrist was sitting on the wrist rest. Now it's aluminium or aluminum, depending on which part of the world you're in. So that should be much better. Looks like the trackpad might be slightly bigger, and the best news of all, function keys. Brilliant. However, it is still $300 for the smaller one or $350 for the larger one. Is it worth the money? When I bought a Magic Keyboard for my iPad Pro, I did find that it increased the utility of the iPad, and it did feel like I'd got a new iPad or a new computer because of that additional utility. So it possibly is worth the money. I think you probably need to try one for yourself to decide that. Obviously, if you spec up an iPad with a Magic Keyboard and a pencil, you're well into the area of MacBook Air pricing. And the MacBook Air is just such a brilliant laptop. So if you're after a laptop, I think you're better off with a MacBook Air running Mac OS. If, however, you want an iPad but you want to be able to type on it and increase the utility of your iPad, then the Magic Keyboard is quite a useful thing. Now, that new Pencil Pro will only be compatible with the newest iPads. And I have a feeling that the newest iPads probably might not be as compatible with the previous Pencil, because the position of the magnets has changed where it attaches to the tablet. So again, we need to get one and review it to be able to know that for sure, but just something to watch out for. This might be a case of, if you're upgrading to the latest iPad, you've got to upgrade all your accessories as well. And that's a bit of a gotcha if that is the case. I guess the final thing that I found a little bit confusing, and I did do a video back along about how confusing the iPad lineup has become. On the one hand, it does seem fairly straightforward. Yeah, we got the cheap one, we've got the small one, which didn't get any updates this time. And then we've got the two mainstream iPads, a more affordable version, which is the Air, and then the Pro version with the all singing, all dancing latest technology. But I still find it a little bit of a confusing lineup because the standard iPad 10 is essentially a very similar design to the smaller iPad Air. And yes, it does have a slower chip in it. But again, for the vast majority of people using the iPad, they will not notice the difference. So if you just want a basic small iPad, the iPad 10 has got you covered, and it makes me wonder why you would then go to the iPad Air. I mean, there are a few things that are better with the iPad Air, but it's also quite a bit more money now. So it is a big step up. And the iPad Air, when it was originally launched, do you remember it was the lightweight version of the iPad? It was the premium version of the iPad. And now we've got to the point where it's no longer the premium version, it's just the standard version, and it's no longer the lightest iPad either, because the new iPad Airs are heavier than the new iPad Pros. So I just want to come back now and talk about the iPad Pro display. I mean, the existing iPad Pro, if you go for the larger one with the mini LED display, it is a phenomenal display. If you're watching HDR content, it's incredible. But the thing is, most of the time you're not watching HDR content. So what you really want is just generally good brightness. And that's what this new display delivers. And it is 1,000 nits. And that is for both SDR and HDR content. Apple has achieved this apparently by layering two OLED screens together. So they call it Tandem OLED. And this is why they needed that new display engine. And it is astonishing to have 1,000 nits of brightness, but it gets even better. For HDR content, it'll even go as high as 1,600 nits. That's really high. Now, my preferred tablet for content consumption is Samsung's Galaxy Tab S9 Ultra, which is a 14-inch tablet. I love this big screen. It's like having a TV. I don't have a TV in my bedroom, so sometimes I like to watch YouTube or whatever. This screen is great. It's got great speakers. It's a really nice display, and it's got Samsung's AMOLED 2X display in it. I've never looked at this display and thought, God, that's a rubbish display. Quite the opposite, in fact. It was the display that made me buy the tablet. But apparently this one peaks at 930 nits. That's peak. And normally it's like 420 or something like that. So 1,000 and 1,600, by comparison, that is a lot brighter. Does that mean it's going to be sort of a retina burning experience when you look at the iPad? No, it doesn't really work like that. But it is going to be brighter. And where you'll really notice it is in well-lit conditions, where the iPad will just be able to get brighter than this tablet would be able to. The thinness that Apple's talking about, this one is actually 5.5 millimeters, so 0.2 of a millimeter thicker than the smaller iPad Pro. So Apple's waxing lyrical about how thin their tablets are, but in fairness, the next generation of Samsung's tablets will probably be thinner as well. It wouldn't surprise me if it's Samsung that's making the display. And there is something else that's interesting about this as well, because the chip that's in this tablet, which is a Snapdragon chip, and it's a good chip. There's nothing wrong with it, but compared to any of Apple's current chips, never going to win in any benchmark test, not for graphics or CPU performance. But again, I've never used this tablet and thought, well, that's a substandard experience, it's really laggy, because it isn't. It's always buttery smooth, and it's great for content consumption and light productivity, which is what I'm using the tablet for. And I'm not suggesting that if you're shopping for an iPad, you should go out and buy a Samsung tablet. I'm not saying that at all. But if you're into content consumption and light productivity and a bit of gaming and all of the stuff that I would suggest probably more than 90% of iPad owners and users will be doing, you just don't need the fastest chip. You don't need the M4. You don't even need the M2. Of course, the iPad 10 and indeed the iPad Air has a 60 Hz display, whereas the iPad Pro gets 120 Hz, but you aren't going to be doing 120 frames per second gaming on your iPad in all likelihood, and you're not likely to be watching 120 frames per second content. So this purely comes down to how the interface feels when you're scrolling around. And most people don't spend their time scrolling up and down web pages just to see how smooth it is. You know, they just use the tablet. So that might not even be that much of a consideration. And this is always the way, isn't it, when we're buying technology, is that we get caught up in the specs. You know, I watched the event last night and I was caught up in it. I was thinking, I don't have an iPad at the moment, and I would quite like to have another iPad. So I was thinking, I almost went through the purchasing process. And the thing that pulled me up was that binned chip. And even though I know that performance core isn't going to make a jot of difference to my experience using the iPad, it still just irks me that I'm missing something that Apple said I was going to get. Now finally, let's just talk about pricing on the iPad Pro, because the pricing has gone up compared to the previous generation. I think by $200 from what I can see. So the 11-inch model starts at $999. Let's just call it $1,000, because that's what it is, $1,000 or £1,000. And if you want the larger model, well, that's $300 or £300 more. And I'm sort of torn with these prices. If you're buying the 11-inch iPad, I think that $200 or £200 uplift is worthwhile. You're getting double the storage, so you're getting 256 instead of 128 on the previous generation, and you're getting M4 versus M2. Okay, those are spec bumps. But that display, previously when you bought the smaller iPad Pro, you got the same display as you get in the iPad Air, but now you're getting that Tandem OLED display just like you get in the larger model. That's got to be worth $200. So if you're into that smaller form factor, then the new iPad Pro 11-inch represents a good upgrade, I would say. And I think the pricing uplift is fair. To go from the smaller to the larger tablet and pay an extra $300 or £300 for basically the same specs, it's the same chip, it's the same storage, it's the same display, just a bit bigger, that doesn't seem like quite such a good deal. And for that one to cost $200 more than the previous generation, again, you are getting double the storage, you're getting a slightly better display, but the mini LED display is already brilliant, and the M2 chip is already brilliant and more than the iPad can use. So what are you paying that extra $200 for? I don't think it's quite such a compelling upgrade. And as always, it's good fun just to do a maximum spec version. So let's just have a go at doing that. If we select the 13-inch model, so that's $1,299 straight away. Choose how much storage? Well, 2 terabytes. Let's do that. I don't imagine many people use that much storage on their iPad. Let's go for the nano texture glass. Let's say Wi-Fi plus cellular. And we're up to $2,599. So $2,600. Then you've got to add another $350 for the keyboard if you want that. I can get my brain to work. That takes us up to what, $2,950. Then you've got another $130 if you want the pencil. So you're over $3,000 for an iPad. That is an expensive tablet, isn't it? Let me know what you think in the comments. Are you going to upgrade with this generation? Are you just really disappointed that the iPad mini didn't get included in the upgrade? What about the iPad 9? That one seems to have silently been discontinued. Are you upset to see that one go? What do you think about the iPad 10 coming down in price? Is that a great move from Apple? Please let me know all your thoughts in the comments. Always enjoy reading all of your comments. Thanks as always for supporting the channel. I'm going to put some links in the description for Amazon stuff. If you've got anything at all to buy on Amazon, doesn't matter what it is, if you click on those links, the channel earns a small commission. Doesn't cost you any extra, but is a big help to us. So thank you for all the support that you give to us. Thank you for your likes and your subscribes and your shares. See you again soon for some more geekery.